Book 10. The Wolves of Turkestan. One of the immediate tasks of Soviet power in Central Asia is to establish proper relations with the peoples of Turkestan, to prove to them by deed the sincerity of our desire to uproot all vestiges of imperialism. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Letter to Comrades, Communists of Turkestan. 1. Like lice on a dinner plate. The north slope of Kara Dagh Mountain, Afghan Turkestan. Nishanchi, sharpshooter. Beyim, sir? What do you make of that? Lieutenant Galib handed the man on watch his field glasses and pointed at the group of darkish dots struggling down the icy slopes of the Black Mountain. The clumsy figures, moving slowly even on the steep incline, looked like things he had once seen weaving about on a microscope slide. There seemed to be about 30 of them, straggling in a line abreast, some alone, some bunched together. They could not be wolves or bears. They were men, all right. The Nishanchi handed back the glasses. They may be hostile. Nikolai's, Effendim. The group was within a mile or so of the high, outcropping crags where the main body of the Turkestani former soldiers were bivouacked, on a reconnaissance mission, 2,000 meters up on the Black Mountain. Survivors of a Russian air crash? The remnant of some mountaineering expedition? The rebel patrol was small, and if this was a trick, it could be wiped out. Lieutenant Galib ran to the foxhole in the snow where his commander, Major Yildiz Khan, lay fast asleep. He had been up all night. The unit always kept 1/3 on alert, the remainder resting or out on patrol, ceaselessly prowling in the permafrost. The enemy might be anywhere, that is, except on the slopes of the impossible Kara Dagh, Black Mountain opposite, where nobody could survive for long. Bimbashi Bey! Galib tugged at the collar of the major's wolfskin coat, sticking out from the top of his sleeping bag. Wake, Beyim! The major was alert in a second, feeling for his revolver deep inside his fur pocket to keep it from freezing solid. Report, Galib. He struggled to his feet. Reporting, sir. Party of men approaching at approximately 800 meters. Good God! Alert the men. Galib gave the order to Chavush Chelik. Sergeant, alert all men for possible hostiles, 800 meters at 11 o'clock. Chelik saluted and was off at a trot. Where exactly are they, Galib? That's just it, sir. They're coming down Kara Dagh. North slope? Oh, Henry, great God, that's impossible. Nobody could mount an attack from there. The lowest pass is at 4,000 feet. Beyim, take the glasses. I've got mine here. The commander pulled his blanket over him like a cape and gasped as the icy air knifed his lungs. After the fug of the foxhole, this was always a shock. One never got used to it. His breath froze in the air, and the crystalline snow crackled underfoot. Sergeant Mahmoud Demir was already at the advanced observation point with the artillery telescope. He came to attention when he saw the major. Amazing, like lice on a dinner plate, Bimbashi Effendi. Yes, that was just what they looked like. The greyish figures, some of them crawling on all fours now, were still advancing, making for the lower ground just in front of and below the strong point. Did they know that they were being watched? By the look of them, they would not even care. People in that condition were as good as dead. They were moving as if by a common will, part of a single organism which told them one thing. If they moved, they lived. If they stopped, they died. The watchers could almost sense that will, like an invisible clock which had been wound up and was forcing the common body, like a clock's hands, to move, Move, move. People were usually found at a later stage than this, lying frozen to death, the snowdrifts covering them, gently offering nature's murder, then her burial. Nature, thought the Major, who rears and comforts us, and is trying to kill us at the same time. But were they Russians? "We could pick them off from here, sir." Sergeant Demir's people came from Soviet Turkestan. His whole family had been wiped out by the Russians for resisting Ruslaştırma, or Russification as the Turks called it, in the USSR 3 decades ago. And that was after the famine, in which 1 million had died. The Major looked at the crawling figures, then up to the birchwood flagpole which stood on the heights behind them. Sergeant Chelik, a stickler for tradition, had just raised it, uncaring, now that action might be near, whether a Russian scout came that way or not. The war flag, the banner of the 3 yak-tails, was the sanjak, the battle ensign of the ancient chiefs. The tails hung from a cross, the emblem of conquest which had made the Crusaders, when they heard of it, believe that Genghis Khan was their imagined Christian ally, Prester John, sweeping from the east to save them. "Chelik, get the rifles out, but keep them in the hotbox." The firing mechanisms would freeze unless the guns were kept warm when they were not being fired. On the other hand, they had to be kept ready. Hence the hotbox, a wooden chest lined with hay and with heated bricks to provide a constant warmth. What some people, in more comfortable lands, knew as a slow cooker, using it in their quiet winters for the evening stew. "Prepare to fire on command, Chelik." The figures were likely to be lost deserters, or else a Russian trap. The Russians were wily, and they had been trying to trap and destroy the Yildiz group for 2 years now. "Fire at will at any hostile movement, Chelik." "Major Bey, perhaps they are a Nikolai unit decimated by the Mujahideen." "I don't think so. There aren't any Mujahideen on the mountain, and if things are so bad on the other side of the Hindu Kush that Nikolais have to struggle over the high passes to get back to Russia, then the war is over." The Major looked again. Most of them were still crawling, but more slowly, as if the sight of the screen of trees had actually eroded their will, made them less, not more, able to carry on. Paradoxical, but he had seen that happen too. Or they could be acting a part. "The rangefinder measures them at 600 meters now, Bayham." Sergeant Demir put the tiny optical instrument back in his warm inside pocket. The Major shrugged. "My guess is that they will never make it to the trees, but let's watch them for a little longer." The Turks were the only highly trained guerrilla band operating in the frozen mountains of the Baglan area, south of the Oxus which formed the Soviet border. Major Yildiz had collected them from a crack unit of the Afghan army, all Turkestanis, shortly after the large-scale desertions began under the communist government, just before the Russians moved in. A professional soldier, Yildiz was not politically minded, but he considered the Red Coups to be banditry, not politics. There had been no elections, no campaigning, no consulting the people. On the contrary, helpless civilians had been shot, strategic points taken, fawning puppets of Moscow installed in power. Treason, to Yildiz, was what the men of the Kabul gang, as he called them, were engaged in. When, even before the invasion, the Afghan Chief of Staff, General Abdul Karim Mustagani, had refused to acknowledge the communist regime and had taken to the mountains, Yildiz had made up his mind. The general had mustered his troops north of the Hindu Kush, and Yildiz, answering his call, organized himself independently, choosing the Baglan area, the far north, as his own area of operations. The Major and other rebel commanders had been very successful. over 1 million Tajiks in the north of Afghanistan were in revolt, battling against 800 Soviet tanks and clouds of aircraft. Yildiz was in command of the resistance for this area in the mountains, where Soviet mountain and Arctic forces, hastily summoned from the Finland border, were reported to be operating. Yildiz and his men watched the approaching figures for an hour. During that time, they covered only 200 yards. They were moving even more slowly now, and 500 yards from the soldiers, they had apparently not seen them yet. They wore no identifiable uniforms, no badges, only furs. There aren't enough of us to risk an attack on them if they're armed, and if they are not and they stop moving, they'll all be frozen to death before we can either kill or rescue them, said the lieutenant. Kill or rescue? Which was it to be? Should he flip a coin? Major Yildiz Khan would have to make a decision soon. If it was a trap, the newcomers would have grenades ready to throw and to blow up their rescuers as they ran to them. They could, just might, be Russians, dropped by a helicopter out of the Turks' line of vision, who would work their way along the ridges to appear here, giving just the impression of a stranded band that they did now. Beyim. It was the lieutenant. If this is a trick, are the Nikolais not taking too great a risk? If the roles were reversed, they would shoot us without any inquiry. Exposed as they are now, we could kill all of them as soon as we liked. I don't think that anyone would take such a tactical decision. Perhaps you're right, Gharib. What do you say, Demir? Take a second opinion and then make a command decision. Command was what orders were for. Major Bey, on reflection, I wish to volunteer to go forward and see whether they make any treacherous move. We could also send small parties, well dispersed, to approach those of them who are walking or lying singly. In that way we would risk less casualties if they have grenades. Yes, I can see no sign of any weapons. As you say, it would have to be grenades. Very well, Sergeant. Go and look at one who seems really feeble. We'll watch you through our glasses. If there is a false move, keep your head down. We'll kill the lot immediately. Dig into the snow if you hear a shot. Beyim. The burly sergeant saluted, tightened the buckle of the massive belt over his fur-lined white parka, clipped 5 Soviet Army stick grenades to it, and ran forward into the snow, zigzagging like a fox. The grey figures had not seen him yet. Major Khan took a rifle from the hot box and wrapped it in a blanket. He tried to squint through the optical sight. It was already frozen, covered in ice. He gave it back to the armourer. Light a fire with some plastic explosive and keep this warm. If anyone attacks Demir, I want to get him first. In each of the foxholes, little bits of plastic were already flickering. The men did not need orders to warm their guns. There were so few options in their lives that they carried on, automatically doing what they could. In this way they worked as individuals, but their discipline was such that any independent action was only in anticipation of an order. Nobody would fire without one, or unless his superior was killed and no order could be given. This training was what had made the Turkish troops the most successful, man for man, of all the nationalities in the Korean War. Louis Palmer at first thought that the big man in the white snow smock and Kalpak wolfskin hat, who wriggled up to him on the frozen ground, must be another member of the expedition. But who? No, it must be a Russian, clean-shaven, with grey eyes, slightly slanting ones. Well, without a weapon, with no strength left, he was a dead man. An American, fighting with the rebels, a mercenary, a bandit, as the Russians had always claimed. Who would believe that he was a volunteer? The newcomer turned Palmer over where he lay on the ground, satisfied himself that he was not armed, looked around at the other staggering figures of the commando, and picked the American up. Carrying Palmer across his shoulders, Sergeant Demir strode back to Major Hahn. The survivors of the Shirkala commando had reached safety in Afghan Turkestan.